Hey YouTube, in this video I'm going to be doing a look at ray tracing performance between the Radeon RX 7600 and the Intel Arc A750. So the reason why we're looking at these two GPUs is because they're both under $300. The Intel Arc GPU is around $250, and with the recent price cuts, because the entry level isn't really selling that well, the 7600 can be had for a similar price as well, depending on where you look. So I thought these would be good ones to compare. Try to look at how feasible is ray tracing at the $250 to $300 price point. So just to start things off, resizable bar, like with all my other previous reviews and comparisons where we're looking at graphics card performance, I always test with resizable bar enabled on all platforms. So the test system is the Windows 10 professional based OS with the AMD Ryzen 9 7950X 3D, because it is the fastest gaming CPU that you can get out of the box without having to do anything. Driver revisions, all tests were done at 1080p resolution. The Intel Arc driver was the latest one that came out earlier this week, and then the Radeon driver is the new press release driver for it's a new unified driver that puts the 7600 on the same driver track as the rest of the Radeon lineup. The first test that I looked at is 3D Mark. I wanted to include 3D Mark because I don't have a whole lot of ray trace based games or games that feature ray tracing, so I figured we'll just put in Port Royale as well as Speedway. So this one is the Port Royale results. You can see the Intel Arc A750 did win with a score of 6,535 versus 5,675. Next we have 3D Mark Speedway. So this one also does test RT. If you read the description on these benchmarks for 3D Mark, both of them list ray trace shadows, ray trace reflections, global illumination. I'm not exactly sure what the difference is between the two of them. All I know is that in terms of the scores, Port Royale was easier to run. You can see here the Speedway results in much lower scores compared to the previous benchmark. So again, the Intel GPU is ahead by a little over 300 points there. So the first game that I looked at that I have available that has ray tracing toggles, I turned them all on, max settings, everything, Far Cry 6 at 1080p. These are the results. So you can see the average FPS, 79 for the 7600 and 68 for the A750. Next, I tested Forspoken. Some people were telling me not to include Forspoken, but I wanted to do it because it's an easy game for me to run. It has a built-in benchmark. You can turn on the ray trace settings. So the way I tested this game is I turned off any sort of upscaler because it likes the default upscaler. So I turned off the FSR. I didn't let it run XESS, although it doesn't run that by default. And then I also just set it to native 1080p and high or ultra high preset. So everything's maxed out on this title at 1080p, and you can see this game is basically a fail. For some reason, the performance is all over the place no matter what. 36 is the average. I had to record minimum and maximum to try to dig in and see if there was any difference. So the minimum for both was 1 FPS. And the maximum, the Radeon card did score higher on the maximum, but it doesn't really tell us anything unique because the average ends up being the same between both of them, which is really strange. I mean, that was the score that it gives you at the very end. It's 36 FPS for both GPUs. Next, we looked at Resident Evil Village. So this is a really good game to include because the ray tracing performance is pretty good, and it is something other than Unreal Engine, and it's not really the typical DXR either. It's Capcom's RE engine, which is featured in a lot of their games, going as far back as like Devil May Cry 5 and Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 7. So it's a very good engine. It's very well optimized for most platforms. And you can see here the results. So the averages, the A750, 91, the RX 7600, 82. So Intel wins in this one. And that was actually pretty surprising because I know that historically the AMD GPUs do pretty good on the RE engine. Next, Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So this is an oldie but goodie, so I like to include it. It's easy to run on Rails. Just run that benchmark, max out the RT settings. There's two of them. There's the shadows and there's the, I think, GI. So I turn those on, and then you launch the game, and then it's on, but it's running on the max preset at 1080p, and these are the results. So the RX 7600 did win with an average above 60, so 64 FPS, and the A750 was just shy of 60 FPS. So next I looked at Hogwarts Legacy. So this is a new game that came out this year. It's a pretty popular game. So this showcases the modern RT performance on Unreal Engine 4. So you can see both GPUs really struggled in this newer title. The AMD card did win at 40 FPS average, and it also did have a higher maximum. But both of them are well below the typical 60 FPS target. That it's, in my mind, it's one of those things where you have to either turn ray tracing off, or you have to leverage upscaling technology like FSR or XeSS in this title if you want it to get better performance, because it just isn't there, right? The game is really, really resource intensive, but even at 1080p resolution, both GPUs are struggling with RT maxed out. Next, I looked at Star Wars Jedi Survivor. This is another game that released a few months ago, so it's a new game for 2023. It's a very good game. It's UE4 based. It does have ray tracing in it, and ray tracing destroys the performance just like with Hogwarts Legacy. You turn it on and you can see the FPS on both cards is very bad. The Intel card was so bad it was below 30 FPS. So it was very stuttery, not a good experience at all. And the AMD card didn't really do that much better, 34 FPS. It did have a much higher maximum, but that we don't really use maximums to determine performance. So the experience overall is similar for both GPUs, but the AMD one can give you that console-like experience. But realistically, you could play this game with the RT enabled. You would just have to use FSR in order to get playable experience, or turn one or two of the settings down or something like that. So the last game that I tested was Quake II RTX, because this one is pure path tracing. This is the only game that I have that does pure path tracing, and it's an old game, so it also is kind of like a good academic case study, if you will, in terms of how you can predict the theoretical RT performance. So it's similar to like something like the Port Royale benchmark, but it is using a custom build. NVIDIA worked with it, or whoever it was, to develop the extensions to put the RTX functionality or the ray trace functionality into the game. And these are the results. So Intel does do pretty well. I did use the profile for Intel that helped it run better, so I will add that. But AMD, regardless of which one I use, I tested both, and it did the same. It gave me the same average in both test cases. So Intel, if you change the profile, then, or you leave it to automatic selection, it tends to perform worse. It's more similar to AMD. But if you do toggle it to, I think it's called Ray Query, it does a whole lot better. And the results show. So here it's doing 64 FPS average. So it's a playable experience with full path tracing. And then the AMD card, it is improved over the previous generation, but unfortunately, especially these entry-level cards where they don't have the chiplets for the MCDs, where this is just one big die, or it's a small die, but it's one unified monolithic chip, just like the previous generation. This one just doesn't push the performance high enough, at least in my opinion, over the previous generation when it comes to ray tracing or path tracing in this title. But it did do pretty good for full 1080p, 53 FPS. So it is showing improvements overall. So if we look at the overall results, so you can see across the board, we did 9 different tests, and it was really back and forth. Intel had some significant wins. They won in the synthetic tests, so the 3D Mark ones. And what I've done is I've scaled these so that those numbers aren't like way off the chart. Basically took the scores and I divided them by 100 for the Port Royale and the Speedway, and that's how you see these numbers here. But if you look at the results, they're back and forth. It's neck and neck. If we were to grade Forspoken based off of maximum, that would have tipped the scale in AMD's favor. So I kind of kept it at the average, meaning if we throw it out altogether, then it doesn't really change anything. Overall, it's an effective tie between the A750 and the RX 7600, which was actually surprising. What it tells me is that the AMD card has much higher rasterization performance. If you guys recall my video where I compared the rasterization performance of the 7600 versus the A770, which is Intel's Premium one level above the A750. The 7600 won across the board in pretty much everything that I tested. Whereas now, when we turn on ray tracing tanks the rasterization performance so much on the 7600 that it falls back in line, where now it's tying with Intel's second fastest card, the A750, in these RT-based titles. Intel did good in 3D Mark and Quake II RTX, so that tells me that the theoretical path trace performance of the Intel architecture is better than the AMD one. However, in real-world games, AMD did tend to win, especially in the modern titles like Hogwarts and Star Wars, which was actually very surprising. That tells me that Intel is behind in its like brute force throughput for rasterization, and AMD can just kind of brute force its way through these RT titles, even though it basically gets taxed enormously when you turn RT on. The sub $300 price point still can't really deliver a good RT experience without relying on FSR or XeSS or DLSS. Basically, you have to rely on upscalers if you want to play your games on a sub $300 GPU. And even if we go over the $300 mark, it doesn't really change the narrative that much at this price point for these type of games with RT enabled and everything maxed out. So that's kind of a look at the overall experience of gaming on an 8GB entry-level graphics card in the lower mid-range to mid-range. I guess that's what I would call these. So they're around $240, $250. That's kind of the price point here. So it's unfortunate because it means that if you game at 1080p and you want to play games with ray tracing enabled, you are going to have to make some compromises regardless of what GPU you're using in this price point. So I hope you guys found this video useful. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on these results. And if you've got any questions, let me know in the comments and I'll respond when I can. And as always, thanks for watching and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks.